So first of all, I want to welcome you. We are going to talk today about instituting effective governance and building out a system around that. I have found that there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of challenges with how to do this and how to do it right. And it's mostly centered around building a new culture. My name is Jason Ewing, and I am the owner and founder of DEWINGIT Healthcare Consulting. I've spent 20 plus years in CIO roles within medium to very large health systems like Catholic Health Initiatives. And so I've migrated this year with some changes in my life over to doing some consulting work to help organizations out in building and putting in effective pieces and modules and capabilities to help organizations become better. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started here. So the outcomes from today, I'm hoping that everyone will have an understanding of governance, how it's critical in a system, know the role and place for technology in healthcare, and you can replace that with any industry, the role of operational leaders in governance and why they are key, and learn about a leading governance framework, what to govern, and insights into the tools used, and then some simple do's and don'ts. So with that, I'd like to make sure that we take and connect governance into the overall organization. And without that, we don't always understand the role and purpose. So this comes from the concepts and principles come from the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. This first portion of this and the rest is going to be focused on the IT, but I think it helps bring some context to where governance's role is. Very simply, there is a work system within organizations, and that means that all their efforts are directed towards providing value to a customer. It's what we call the one system that rules them all. Most organizations are spending a lot of time trying to improve that work system. There is another system that is there, and it's called the support system across an organization. All three dimensions need to be connected to a work system, and I'll tell you that I'll go through here the three dimensions. But that support system supports the work system, which delivers the value to the customer. One of the dimensions is the alignment of the support system to the work system. And that, some examples here are the strategy deployment, visual management, and the voice of the customer. Then there's engage, which is the recognition, idea generation and sharing, and education and training within that support system. And finally, the third dimension is the improve. How does the support system improve problem solving, standard processes, and visual management? So these dimensions, once again, work within a support system. If functioning correctly, will add value to that work system, which delivers value to the customer. So this is where governance fits in, is in that support system. And it's how we connect governance to that work system is what we're going to talk about today. So we want to start out with the what and the why of governance. And the way that I look at and define governance, it's a formal support system capability that organizations use at various levels to drive appropriate decisions, priorities, changes, to achieve that work system strategy and objective that they're working at. Without knowing what those are, the support system ends up in a state of guessing or getting glimpses of information to try to navigate appropriately. So governance is a way to break down the silos that happen in operations in that work system and helps bring them together and organize it in a way to drive the right kinds of decisions across the whole enterprise. It's also a great way to organize those decisions and manage those across the service lines throughout a healthcare system. You'll see some of this as we go through. It's actually a formal group, and what I call the service line owners with the authority to make operational decisions. And as we understand the role of technology within an organization, well, this becomes more clear of why these service line owners have got to drive the outcomes that they're wanting, because technology is just a tool that enables those processes. And we'll talk more about that. It's also a conduit for driving standards, eliminate duplicative processes, and remove a lot of waste that goes on in organizations. It's a way to align operational priorities and to ensure that IT is working on the right stuff. I can't tell you the number of times, and you probably have some stories around this as well, is where you're not sure who's really leading and what really is the priority and what's important to be working on, so that the IT resources can be aligned and the energy behind them and their expertise can help drive what's important. Many times operations is not sure what their priorities are, but once again, governance brings them together, brings some transparency to that stuff, and then allows for them to make some clear, tough decisions. Once again, makes the technology and investments achieve those operational outcomes, and then to give greater control to operations. Now, when I say greater control, it's visibility and decision making. It's not actually, opening up access and giving them the ability to configure and program stuff. It's really control over how they want their destiny to come, how they are trying to achieve that, and then they can make the decisions around the technology to enable that. Without that, the level of transparency and giving them and putting them in a position to make those type of decisions, they don't have a lot of control, and IT ends up in the space of having to manage that, and that's not always appropriate. So let's talk about the role of technology in an organization, because this will set the foundation for governance and make sure that we understand that. So in organizations, there is capabilities. And these capabilities, and here's some examples of financial management as a capability to run a health system, access management, collection management, care management. All these things are capabilities that organizations have to deliver the services that they do. Now, those capabilities are supported by one or more processes. Example, how do we assign beds in a hospital? Or, is that bed assignment process the same at multiple hospitals? What's the budgeting process? How do I order supplies? These are all processes that someone owns, leads, and drives. In some organizations, it's not clear who that is, nor is it clear what the inventory of these processes even are. So we can start to see where things start to break down here. The application then does two things. It supports and automates the processes, and it collects and manages the data. So the final piece is the infrastructure. This is how we access these applications, how we interact with the applications and our processes. It's kind of the hardware piece and the backbone behind behind the applications. So why is this important? In healthcare, most everybody understands the capabilities. What happens is that organizations and leaders and various folks will take their capabilities and they will jump down here to the technology, and they will skip the processes, and they will look to the technology to drive changes in their processes of which they may or may not know. Or we may end up with duplicative technologies carrying out the same kind of functions and capabilities and processes in multiple locations because people like certain things. That's what causes problems in and the breakdowns in these systems. So what governance does is as we manage this stuff, manage the applications, we're really managing the processes that are ahead of that. So it's so vitally important that process owners are a part of the governance process, and they're leading and driving it for their areas. So this is a very critical, fundamental piece that everyone needs to understand, not just IT, but in operations, where the role of technology is. So there are what I call principles of governance, and it's how we want to behave. And this is a lot about culture, and it's a mindset and a thinking that we have to put ourselves in. So what I call IT believes. IT believes that 98% of the technology IT doesn't need to run IT. Rather, the business needs. So when we look at the expense of technology for a health system, you have to break that down and say what technology is actually used for IT versus everybody else. So most of these systems, IT doesn't need to run itself. It's helping everybody else run. And then there's the gaps there that happen with the transparency of what those technologies are to run your labs, run your pharmacies, those kinds of things. Also, IT believes that it consults and advises. It does not make operational decisions. Too often, organizations, process owners, departments, they look to IT to tell them what to do. We have to be careful. That's a danger zone to get in because you don't have control of those operational processes. All we can do is advise and consult on what you can and cannot do. Every service line or department needs full transparency on its technology needs, appetites, demands, and risks. Too often, IT gets these requests from staff levels. It bypasses process owners or department leaders. They're coming in from everywhere. And without the transparency on all that demand and the appetite for new stuff, or even the risk, they can't make decisions. So we believe that we've got to be more transparent about that. We also believe that 20% of IT resources time is IT's. And it's focused on break fix, maintenance, and documentation. The rest of the time of the IT resources is what I call a checkbook of time. And it's for governance to spend however they like. IT doesn't care, to this next bullet point, IT doesn't care what work they want done. It's just they want to make sure they're doing the right work made by decisions of the right people. Operations needs to have more control over their technology and what work gets done. And IT does not control operational processes. Operational leaders do, and they believe that the technology enables the operations. Really driving home the behavior and the culture here of where IT sits in the organization and where the leaders do. So this is what I call the accountability and ownership burden. So most organizations, IT ends up carrying about 70, 73% of the burden of these projects that are really for operations. And operations carries about 30 to 36% of that. Now, when I talk about the burden of this, it's the CIO's responsibility to execute and deliver that. And it's in IT's more held accountable for that delivery, but without the control of the operational staffing and change and all of those pieces. What needs to happen is that's got to shift. Operations needs to take more of the sponsorship, executive role, leadership to drive the operational changes that they're looking to achieve more so than IT. So moving on here, there are leaders in IT that will take, or even, I guess this could go across the board, they take what's called a tools-driven approach, and it ends up becoming what they call the flavor of the month. There's a piece called the Hawthorne effect, and that is when you focus your attention as a leader on something, you all of a sudden get outcomes. But the minute that you divert your attention away from that, the outcomes and results start to fade off. And this is what creates this cycle that you see here. When you try to make improvements over time, you get outcomes, but they're not sustainable. And when you use tools to drive a system, you get this type of result. What we want to do is take and make sustainable system-driven approach, which means that we are taking small incremental steps along a path and a journey to build a new way of doing things. It becomes the culture, and it doesn't have to be done overnight. You can gain an enormous amount of value in governance by making some of these small incremental steps, not doing a massive overhaul. You can slowly start to mature, and then all of a sudden you start to see the value start, and then people go, I can't live without that. I've got to have it. And as new employees turn over, new people come in, it's really the way in which things are done, and you get this increased improvement and value over time. So when we talk about some of the governance pieces here today, think about it in terms of, I can't do everything. I've got to make small incremental steps. If you've got one committee today that you're doing something with, introduce some new things and start to mature it. But you've got to keep the vision of the broader perspective of where that more end state comes from or comes to. This is what I call a case for change. So typically when you get to a position where you've got to make a change in what you're doing because you're not getting the value out of it, maybe people are participating as much, it's kind of just a meeting that people go to because, you know, they've got to show support. So what I call the case for change, and here are about 6, and there can be other ones, but this gives you some good examples of why we would want to change governance. There is a lack of allocated ownership across clinical, business, and IT leadership. Okay, this goes back to that burden of accountability. It's unbalanced in the decision-making and project execution. Okay, we would want to change. A single body governing IT at a high level, creating bottlenecks in throughput and disjointed decision-making at different levels. There's a lack of operational process owners involved in governance, representing the system. So it perpetuates the siloed decision-making, you know, and then it creates the confusion of what the priorities are. IT is assumed to be accountable by default, okay, in executing these projects. And that burden is very heavy, it's very stressful. And I've implemented this model we'll talk about here several times, and it is an amazing shift of weight off of IT into operations. You know, and so it's IT becomes more effective. Governance today could become it transforms into an IT progress update meeting instead of decision making. And all of a sudden you get disengaged leaders, people that don't show up, and then IT becomes overwhelmed. And then finally there's a lack of readiness and technology transparency among service lines, which creates the unnecessary demand and churn. So these are some reasons why you may want to relook at and change the way that you're doing things today. In healthcare, there's a transformation that's going on with these systems. On the left-hand side, and this could be in a hybrid, it could be the way it is, you know, there's various ways in which this is looked at. On the left-hand side, you'll see here, you've got an orthopedics department and a pain center. Registration may be done by and controlled and managed those processes by those departments. What that leads to is your variation in the processes. Orthopedics is registering patients differently than the pain center, which then behind the scenes means that all these changes are coming into IT to tweak it for everybody because they can't seem to come to agreement on what those standards are. The consumer gets confused. So we go back to that work system to deliver value to the customer. They're confused now on how that process works. You get differing outcomes, difficult communication, you get complex standardization to be able to manage, and you end up with a lot of siloed performances. Over to the right-hand side, in a work system model, you have one registrar that is responsible for the processes and delivery of those services across all entries into the health system. Now you get accountability for those common processes regardless of locations. You start getting standard outcomes and communications becomes more consistent. The consumer's experience improves because it's consistent. Making changes to those processes are much easier because it's the service is being delivered from a single service line. You can drive data and process standardization, and you end up with more of an enterprise performance management environment. Now, all of a sudden, when there's changes that need to occur or new technologies that need to be implemented, you've got that's going to happen across the enterprise, but you have clarity on who owns those processes and delivery of those services. So building an effective governance capability first starts with a clear vision. And then if you look at a lot of the people change management philosophies out there and frameworks and concepts, it always seems to start with having a clear vision of where we're going. I always ask people, do you know the difference between a vision and a dream? And I said a dream, let me back up, let me make sure I say this right. A vision, you can see yourself on top of the mountain. A dream is the mountain comes to you. So it's very important as leaders to create a clarity around the vision of where we're going and the why and the purpose behind it all in order to gather momentum with people in going forward. The next is understanding the goals that we need to have. Okay? Without the goals, we miss the guardrails that get us to that vision. And finally, what I call the principles or the way in which we behave along that journey and along that route. And I'll give you kind of an example, is that governance members communicate decisions, not IT. So if there's a decision to change the way an intake process happens in a clinic and how those handoffs go, IT can change the technology, but those decisions need to be communicated out from those governance members because they are the face of those changes. So let's talk about what will be governed. So there's 5 areas to be governed. And there are, I'm only giving a few examples here, but there's a whole slew of things under each one of these that you want to govern. So process and data. So one of the things that governance wants to do is govern the standards, not technology standards, but the process standards and what those are. Another area is around the technology itself, governing the applications. For example, if an organization wants to, let's just say a clinic would like to go out and engage in another reference lab to do their lab work with. Well, there's 4 or 5 of them already. Does the lab across the enterprise have visibility on all of those reference labs? And are they making decisions around what are the standard reference labs that we're going to use? Are we going to go to 1? Are we going to have 5? All of that has technical implications to the system or systems. In addition, you want to govern the changes that occur. So I had an organization one time that wanted to do a smoking cessation assessment, and it was a clinic. There was a bunch of clinics out there, and one of the clinics said, yeah, we've decided we want to capture in the assessment of the patient a smoking cessation assessment. And all of a sudden, the change went into place. It affected the whole organization, and everybody went, wow, why is this required now? When did this come through? Well, it has bypassed the owners of all of those processes or the owner of the process, nor was it communicated out. Once again, IT doesn't necessarily care. We do the work, but operations has a huge impact to their technology and their work system. Once again, I reiterate here that there are 5 or 6 more things under these things that you govern. Strategy and roadmap. So the governance will manage what is the operational strategy, or what is the strategy for the health system or the organization. Why that's important is because that helps drive prioritization. If there is no clarity on the activities and strategies of the departments, this is a time for those groups to begin to work on what that is. And how does that align to the overall organization strategy? New capabilities, new systems that come in, gosh, we need a new technical widget, whatever it is, or we're changing one out. And then finally, risk. How do we manage the business risk as well as the technology risk? All of these things, there are a lot to govern. And the list, like I said, I've got a lot of things there, but these are probably the 4 core things that you would want to start out with to help governance manage. You remember, take incremental small steps along this journey. You don't have, if you want to start figuring out process owners, start with that and start reconstituting your composition and figure out who is the owners. I had an organization, it was actually an HR department that we had 2 divisions and 2 different HR groups doing different things. And I had to force one name in the box. I couldn't have 2 representatives from 2 regions then arguing it out in the middle of governance. We needed to have one person that represented that. And it forced a lot of communication and change operationally in what they were going to do. And it became less focused on the technology capabilities and started bringing more alignment to the work system itself. So this does an enormous amount of work to connect to the work system. Here's what a kind of a basic framework of a governance model. And at the top here you have the executive leadership group. You can call it whatever you want, but their focus is primarily on making decisions around the large strategic investments and the priorities, ensuring that they're executed, and they're executed down below. They're also an arm for escalations and how to remove barriers. They're very strategically focused. This middle group is what I call the cross-functional steering committees. And they're made up of various groups. And what they are is down below, they're the committee chairs of these domain operational committees. But this group they're responsible for ensuring the operations is carrying out the strategy, the work across the domains, and they coordinate because there's a lot of handoffs from a patient that comes through the emergency room, whether they go to a different department like radiology or lab. There's coordination, and not everything is siloed into a specific department or service line. They begin to start touching externally, and these groups help deal with that to improve the function of the work system. And then down below, so they're focused mostly on systemness. And then down below here, these are the operating committees. Now some of them could be existing committees that are already in place. Some of them may be new because they've never formed themselves across the health system. They focus on the operational process changes, prioritizes IT work. They manage the operational roadmaps. This is where the bulk of the work happens and the decisions are made. Transparency is brought to. They're focused on the delivery. Now, what's important is that this is a charter that I use to help. I standardize this across the board for every single governance group. That way you get consistency and you get the same level of focus everybody has on it. When the upper left is usually just a kind of a quick model of what the governance structure looks like. And it could be different for every area, every organization. Typically you'll have a pretty clear description of what the committee's responsibility for and doing. Over to the top right, accountabilities within the committee. Down at the bottom, abilities, clearly detailing out what they are responsible for. There's an example is review and recommend new business cases, or maybe responsible for communicating decisions after the meeting. In the kind of the middle section to the left is the composition. This composition of this operating committee is made up of the process owners, and one of the process owners is the chair of that committee, not IT. IT, when I usually stand these up, will help facilitate the first couple of them, but it quickly transitions over to an operating process owner. And then there's an IT leader that's there, a voting member, but also as a critical role of advising and also helping them understand the impacts that they may have across the system as it relates technologically. And then at the bottom, this is very important to articulate out, and that is what authority does the committee have over what decisions? And where does the authority come from? In some organizations, I've had to go and get that authority, go over this charter and get the authority from the board, senior leaders in the organization that say, yes, we are delegating that level of authority to that group or groups to be able to manage. This way it's clear and concise of what they are responsible and what they can do. When you institute governance, there are some stages that you go through for maturity. And it's fascinating to watch happen, and every operating committee and group matures a little bit differently, but they all go in the same direction. You know, the first phase is just really kind of getting things established, and that is the orientation to the committees, helping them understand their roles, you know, getting the right composition made up, just really kind of formalizing the effort and articulating out the purpose and why. Then within the first couple of months, it seems to be very focused on technical things. And then it quickly, sometimes I've seen it happen within the first couple of sessions of governance, and then it quickly, all of a sudden, this is where the burden shift happens. All of a sudden, the dialogue and conversation changes to now the business side of issues. And so all the inquiries and concerns and questions, they start dealing with more and more of that, because IT is bringing more clarity to all of the demand and the requirements that are out there. Finally, after about 6 months, somewhere in there, you start adding in, back to the what we govern slide, you start slowly adding in the right other elements that they would need to govern, and you start introducing new things. That's that slow maturity as you grow. This is kind of just a fun, this is kind of a diagram, just a picture here of that shift of ownership burden moving off of IT over to the operations and business leaders to drive what they want done. So within the governance, it's important to develop out these principles. They're principles that are around how we make decisions. So one of the things that's important to develop out here is a clear set of these that will articulate, and this is part of when you orient your governance group. So I'll give you this as an example. Here is, you know, your key constituents may be employees and partners. The guiding principle in the governance may be think globally, act locally. And then we need to articulate what it means. It means that we recognize the differences and diversities across its locations and communities, and designs and delivers its services to support those differences. And then why is that principle important? We want to structure our services to be consistent and familiar, regardless of where they are accessed, to achieve quality at a low cost. That may be a why. And you would list out these guiding principles that would help in the decision-making in governance. So when something comes up, you can bang it up against these principles and say, hey guys, it doesn't match our principles. That's something that's going to be a siloed, one-off thing, and that's not what we're about. So there's a few things I mentioned earlier that you want to probably start out governing. And they are service requests, which I call IT demand. This is where the organization has a checkbook of IT time to spend it on these things however they want. Changes, your application portfolio, and the communication. So let me talk about a few of these things. Some people don't understand what an application portfolio is. I do a webinar on We Are Hoarders of Technology, and we talk about in more in depth about an application portfolio. Once again, the role, if you understand that applications support processes, when you look at this application portfolio here, if you let's look at pharmacy here. This organization had 27 pharmacy systems. This 74 was IT, and that dealt with a lot of the, you know, Adobe Acrobat readers, kind of your desktop stuff that was out there. But when you look at this, if a operating committee had a listing of all 27 of their pharmacy systems, they could begin to make some decisions now as it relates to processes and consistency. I've told executive leaders before, you want to know where to focus on process improvement, look at your application portfolio. It'll tell you exactly where you need to look. You know, imagine having 34 imaging systems. You know, try to track down a PAC study somewhere. And, you know, this organization is very indicative of a lot of merger and acquisition activity, not a lot of deployment of standardization. And they end up in a circumstance where they've got tons of silos, their work system's inefficient, and they don't know if they're truly delivering value to the customer. It's not always easy to see. So being able to get your arms around an application portfolio and provide that transparency to governance so that they can begin to start making some decisions. And we'll talk about that here. So one of the important pieces here in a domain, which is a department or service line, is these three themes that you build your application portfolio out in so that they can make decisions. And you have a theme, you have domains, you have your capability, you have your application and module, you have your cost, and you have your roadmap. The themes, you put your applications in these themes that says enterprise standards. They're here to stay. They need to be used across all locations. Maybe they're deployed, maybe they're not. Okay, but it's the declaration, is this a enterprise standard or not? Then if it's not, then it could move into the bucket of it's a non-standard. It's being used in production today, but it does need to be replaced by the enterprise standard. Hence why the roadmap is so important, because we need to ask the question, okay, operations, when do you want to do that? When do you want to start driving standardizations out in your processes? And you start to document that on a roadmap. And finally, the application could be that we need to shut it down. Maybe it's not even being in live production. We've replaced it with something, but we've got to maintain the data. But we've got to put it on a timeline because these things cost us money and we need to shut them down. So we've got to start having some decisions and discussions around what we want to do with the legacy data. So as you can see from this, this becomes a very critical thing at providing transparency and decision-making that these these domain committees, operating committees can begin to make some decisions around. IT can do a really good job at presenting it. So standing up governance like a project, right? Make sure you have goals, key deliverables, clear sets of activities that need to be done. What are the artifacts? For example, we're going to have a domain committee orientation. That's an artifact. It's something that you have that's going to help build this culture and build this way of decision making, how we work together. And then finally, what resources are required for that. Now, there's some do's and don'ts in all of this that I'll share with you. And the first one is do communicate a lot. Okay, I can't tell you, the more you're repetitive about stuff, the more people begin to take hold of the culture and the conversations. Do allow operational leaders to take charge. I'm a big proponent of it. Hey, take the power, take the control, have it. You know, I want you to do that. I have some leaders that don't want to do it, but this forces that conversations and forces them into a position where, you know, you're a leader in the organization. You need to lead the work system and how you're going to deliver that. Do keep IT out of the operational decision making. Do provide IT advisory and consulting services. Do bring lots of decisions that need to be made. If you want to see increased activity and commitment, bring decisions, especially to physician groups. There's only one don't, and I call it don't, avoid, stay away, run from. And it's using governance as a status update meeting. That is a trap that you will find yourself getting caught into, is when all of a sudden your projects are turning into, hey, here's the progress of this, here's the progress of that. That should be done at a very quick, high level, should be about 5 minutes in a governance meeting, but the rest of that ought to be handled in each one of the projects and the steering committees for those projects. But you want to start getting disengaged leaders, people not showing up, ineffective discussions. Start providing status update meetings, and you'll get that type of result. So, conclusion here, we're going to be providing, already provided a webinar already like this on the hoarders of technology today, talking about effective governance. This Friday will be the same exact presentation to go over with another group of folks that couldn't make it today. In January, we'll be having instituting effective data programs. We were working on scheduling with Donna Carter around data management life cycles. And then with the Institute of Enterprise, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. We'll be presenting the hoarders of technology to those business leaders, mostly chief operating officers and executives, around these concepts around too much technology, the application portfolio, and how that impacts and influences the processes. So with that, I do want to give the Institute of Enterprise Excellence some acknowledgement of some of their concepts around work systems and support systems. And then finally, you know, we're here doing it to help organizations put in effective governance and do it right. And, so maybe I'll go ahead and stop there. I don't have the sound. There's some folks that maybe joined a little bit afterwards, but if there's some questions that may be there, go ahead and feel free to open up the chat and ask those. Stephen, I think you're probably the one out there. If there's anything that you've got, any questions, you can have the floor here. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question on the copy of the deck. Actually, what I will do is you will get a link to the webinar that you can reference. So I hope that will be helpful. Well, sounds great. I appreciate, Stephen, you participating today. There is the same presentation on Friday. There's some other folks that you may know that may gain some value out of this. Please feel free to share the email and have them attend and participate. So thanks again, Stephen and Michelle, for your help. And we'll go ahead and conclude here.
Thanks, Jason.